Kwegwe, which is the Mohawk version of saying hello, hello. Anyway, it's an honor to be here, and also relief, because as you can imagine, where I come from, in the area where Canada and U.S. meet, it's rather frigid right now. So it's good to be here. And as we do when we ever gather together as human beings, our duty is to acknowledge each other, to embrace each other with kindness and good words, to turn our eyes in a different direction, to acknowledge the many gifts of our Mother Earth, who has enabled us to be here in good health, and then to go through the different elements of Earth, to acknowledge the waters, animals that live within the waters, the plants upon the earth, even the smallest of insect beings. We acknowledge the trees upon the earth. And for the Mohawk people, the leader tree is the maple tree, because that's the one that gives us its blood in the spring, enables us to renew our spirits. And every springtime, when we see that the maple tree is sap beginning to flow, that is when we know the plants are gradually waking up. And then we take that maple sap, we make it into maple syrup. One of the great gifts that our Mohawk people have given to the world is maple syrup, among many other things. So we acknowledge that. We acknowledge the healing plants, the medicine plants. There's no illness in human experience that cannot be cured with the right approach to specific plants. We acknowledge the animals. And to us, the leader animal, whenever we put our minds and we think about these words, is a deer. And the name in Mohawk for deer is Askanondo. And it was later written down as Skenando, and then became that beautiful word Shenandoah. And that's my wife's family. We acknowledge that there are winds that caress the earth, that above that there are thunder beings. So whenever the springtime comes and we look to the west, we see that the thunders have returned. And that with that thunder, they bring lightning. And what that lightning does is when it hits the earth, it energizes the earth. It acts as a wake up for the earth. There's also another story that we tell, that the thunder and the lightning, what they do is they keep the evil things deep within the earth. And should they one day abrogate their duties, then those elements will return to the surface of this earth and cause great harm. So we're grateful that they continue to watch over us. And then we acknowledge, of course, there's our eldest brother, the sun, our grandmother, the moon. There are spiritual teachers who come to us now and then when we stray and remind us of our duties towards each other and towards the universe. We acknowledge that there is a creator. And in Mohawk terminology, which is decidedly feminine, that we believe that the creator is in fact a feminine element. And that when we tell our stories about the origin of human beings, the first human type presence on this planet is a sky woman. And she came from a certain cluster of stars. And during the winter time, we just concluded this ceremony. We look to the north and to the east, and we see the rise of this cluster of stars that you call the Pleiades, or we call the seven dancers. And it is that cluster of stars that we say human beings came from. So when you ask an Iroquois person, a Mohawk person, well, who are you? Well, we don't believe that we are descendants from primates. We believe that we came from a cluster of stars and that we are, in fact, star people. And when we take the last of our sacred breaths in this life, that our spirit undergoes a transformation. We are embraced by our elders, and they were guided along what you call the Milky Way, the star path, back to that cluster of stars, where we enter into the universe and this great awareness. We are then told of why we were given the gift of life, what our duties were. And if we fulfill those duties, then we remain within that place where light itself has consciousness. But if we're bad, and we did harm to people, then we have to manifest ourselves and come back here until we learn to do things right. But ours is a reality that is overwhelmingly feminine. That as you might have heard, that the Iroquois Confederacy, through a series of deliberate acts, created a democratically based government, and over which people had certain inherent freedoms. And unlike most places in the world, those we call the life givers, the women of our community, had a highest degree of liberty than any other human society that I know of. That it was women that oversaw our families. We took our names from women. The women leaders of our respective clans, of which there are three amongst the Mohawks, the Bears, Turtles, and Wolves. They controlled the nomination process for anyone who aspired to be a leader. So unlike the United States, where you have months and months of agitation, trying to select that person who best represents you, in Iroquois way, it was done very simply. We gave it to and acknowledged the inherent right of women to determine which person had the best qualifications. And they would meet in what you'd call caucus, and incidentally, caucus is an invention of American Indian people, and they would decide, and then they would bring that candidate before the clan. The clan would then endorse or reject that individual, and if endorsed, it would pass on to the Nation Council and then to the Iroquois Confederacy. So there were all sorts of phases an individual had to go through in order to become a representative of the Iroquois Confederacy and the Mohawk Nation. And so those people who demonstrated ferocious and terrible ambition, a desire to wield power, those are exactly the people who were rejected by our people. We did not reward ambition. We rewarded competence, compassion for the people. But once installed into office, they had very specific rules to abide by. A cardinal rule is this. We call it the seventh generation principle, and that is do nothing that in any way qualifies the right of the unborn to live in a condition of freedom, personal liberty, and also to have the means by which to sustain their lives and that of their families and their nations, which means that our generation, your generation, under Iroquois law, can do nothing that in any way contaminates the environment or somehow makes it impossible for your great-great-great-grandchildren to live and to thrive and enjoy happiness. And if you ever go to upstate New York, you'll see that it's amongst the most beautiful places in the world. It has a balance of seasons and abundance of, did anyway, abundance of wildlife, immaculate waters, fertile valleys, and that is the place where our Iroquois people developed our identity as members of our distinct nation states. Turtle Island here, this is the homeland to Aboriginal people, different nations, hundreds of nations. And if you look at North America, it is in the shape of a turtle. And the question I raised at one of these sessions was, how do we know this? You know, we didn't have satellite photography or imagery, but somehow people were able to transcend the physical limitations of the human body and engage in travel by sending their spiritual messages across great distances. You'll see in this story that all of you will eventually watch with marvel that we had wide use of crystals as a communication device across geographical different distances. And that was a very important part of Mohawk life, to take a crystal and put it here, and then by doing that, you were able to transmit your thoughts to another person who might have the same type of device. So long before it became standard in radio, telecommunications, we were aware of the power of crystals and the vibration that's within those stones. This is, of course, North America. All of you are probably aware that it was a very diverse number of nations that lived here, and that our Iroquois people are located in the Northeast around Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and the St. Lawrence River Valley. When it comes to origins, the fundamental question in American anthropology, and something I want you to think about and to challenge, and then use your reason. And what I'd like you to do is then dismiss it entirely, and that is somehow that Native people came from Asia, that this Bering Strait theory is somehow become entrenched in the American mind to the exclusion of our own oral traditions. And that's always been a challenge to us. Where does our story, the story of our lives, our history, our telling, and how often it conflicts with the overall broad narratives that define what is considered American history and the science of anthropology and archaeology. But if you follow and give us the respect and listen to us and follow our storyline, it is completely illogical, downright silly to think that a small group of humans somehow made their way across hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles of tundra in Siberia and crossed the Bering Strait and encountered an ice shield that was 2 miles high. And that by some miraculous act, they made their way on a very skinny corridor and found their way into North America. And if you walk through the streets of Manhattan, you know what wind does, right? In wind tunnel, when you're going down Broadway or one of those north-south corridors, and you can imagine going for 2,000 miles on a similar narrow corridor, and then coming here and giving rise to a diverse population of indigenous people with a wide variety of languages. And within this relatively short period of time, 10,000 years, going all the way to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, and all the languages that literally take hundreds of thousands of years to become distinct. But within that so-called Clovis period, Clovis, New Mexico is right here, that somehow we managed to do this. It's just totally crazy. Where did we come from? Well, we came from this place here. In our genetics, our DNA, they recently did the study of a man from here, Blackfoot country in Montana, and they found that it traces DNA has nothing Asian about him. And in fact, there's a strong connection between his people and the Polynesians. So, where do we come from? Common sense, Southwest. Anyway, that's our story. And of course, our Iroquois Confederacy was the strongest military, economic, political force in colonial America, that we formed a rigid border along the Allegheny Mountains, stretching all the way from New York State to the Carolinas. And we restricted the colonists to remain east of that line. And I'll tell you this, the primary cause of the American Revolution was not pursuit of liberty and equality, because we know that myth, what happened after they gained American independence. In fact, there was less freedom in the American colonies than there was before, and slavery became even more firmly entrenched. And so we were opposed to this idea that they would defy their rightful government. And our Iroquois Confederacy, we remained neutral, but elements within the Confederacy took sides. And as a result, that line, that demarcation, was evaporated, and the American colonists were able to go westward. That's my homeland in upstate New York. Here's Syracuse and Albany, Rochester, and Buffalo. But that's our traditional homelands. And where I come from, because it's an integral part of the story I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to summarize this, and then we're going to move directly into residential school. But it's where the province of Ontario, Quebec, and New York meet. And this is Quebec, Ontario, and New York. It's on the St. Lawrence River, about 100 kilometers southwest of Montreal. And it's one of the most fertile grounds in North America when it comes to fisheries. Our people were known as harvesters of fish. And it was a very self-sustaining community up until the Americans and Canadians decided that they were going to build the St. Lawrence Seaway, which goes right through our territory. When they did that, they disrupted the natural flow of the waters, and they introduced a lot of invasive species. You guys have problems with the boa constrictor and other things that should not be here. Well, the same with us. A lot of fish like carp and others that were held within the bilge holes of these tankers were brought, and they discharged the waters, and those things began to overtake us. So what happened was a severe disruption in the economic lives of our community, a loss of independence, and then also a almost fatal compromise in culture, because people in the generation before me, my father and grandparents and others, who prided themselves on being self-sustaining, who knew the natural world, who were intimate in their understanding of the flow of nature and animal-plant movement, that no longer was viable. And their instruction to us, people in my age who were born in the 1950s, was put aside that language and that culture because it's been destroyed. What good does it do to you speak a native language if if you can't communicate the way we did with that lifestyle? Now, with that comes, and there we're located right at the juncture of these, with this. That's the last Jesuit mission in North America in our community. It's called St. Regis, named after a Jesuit priest who administered to poor people in Lyon, France in the 1600s. But when they imposed the Catholic Church on us, what they did is we used to have what we call a ceremonial building here, a long house in which we had ancient ceremonies, pagan rituals. And when the church came, it burnt that, and then they put this edifice on here. And in an odd way, it was my family, my great-great-grandfather, grandfather, who built this church. We learned the art of masonry and how to work stone from the French Canadians. And then throughout the history of this church, it's over 200 years now, my family has been given the task of keeping it in good repair. And I was born and raised right here. You see that telephone pole? That's our house. That's where I was born. And I was a good Catholic before Vatican II in 1965, when they switched to church and altar. And it used to face away from the people, and you spoke only in Mohawk and Latin. There was no English spoken here. But the church was advocates for integration, and they accelerated the loss of culture because they consider most of our ancestral customs as paganistic, and they were very effective in what they did. But at a certain time, both Canada and the United States, after they had used military force to actively suppress and then to forcibly remove Native people from our homelands, it was Thomas Jefferson who came up with this idea that relocation, that maybe it was best for Native people to remove themselves from the avarice of the settlers. And you got to remember the settlers, who they were, the actual people. They were not all Daniel Boone type of people. These were the very dregs of European society, and they were pushed westward, very brutal people. And Jefferson saw this as a source of great confrontation between indigenous people and the American colony, the American states. So what he advocated is that there should be a system by which Native peoples are removed by force if necessary, their lands held up for sale, and then the children confined to or brought to and then taught the elements of that myth called European civilization. And so in 1819, what the federal government did is it entered into a series of contracts with religious organizations, organizations would then take the children and put them into these institutions, and then try to remove whatever elements they had of a native identity and replace it with Christian subservience. This became standard in the U.S. and Canada. The first school in Canada was 1831, and that was at this place called the Mohawk Institute, located about 100 kilometers west of Montreal. And their children were brought in there, and they were subject to a militaristic type of lifestyle. And the way it worked on our communities, the way the selection process was arbitrary. It would involve a small group of people. It involved a local priest, a Jesuit priest. It involved a healthcare worker. It involved usually a nurse. It involved a government official called the Indian agent. Now, up until the 1970s, on most communities in Canada and in some of the United States, whatever you did on your community was overseen by an agent appointed by the federal government called an Indian agent, who had dictatorial powers over almost all parts of your lives, who controlled jobs, residence, family life, in conjunction with the Christian churches. And so they would meet together, and they would say that this family has children, and those children might be at risk. And therefore, perhaps it's better if we take that child and remove that child from the parents and then place them in one of these institutions. There are 150 at the peak in Canada, across the country. The last one closed in 1996. In Canada, there were well over 150,000 Native children that were processed through this system. In the United States, there was 533 boarding schools. Now, when you say boarding schools, you might think, what is it called? Dead Poet Society, right? Or any other of these movies that kind of idealize a group of guys getting together, almost always guys, right? And forming this clubship and going on to Yale and becoming masters of the universe, right? That's how you think about it, boarding school. Northfield, Mount Harmon was the other one, Phillips, Exeter, those kind of things. That's not our experience at all. In those schools, you were solicited for your ability to master certain disciplines, academic disciplines. And in our case, it wasn't that you weren't encouraged to learn. Matter of fact, those people who demonstrated an ability to again tackle complex subjects like English and mathematics and social studies, those people were considered suspicious, and they had to be subdued, whatever means was available. So you have this in Canada. You have this in the United States. The children are taken to these institutions against which your parents have no appeal. Now, I assume because you people are all healthy-looking people with good minds, you're here in a good college, that you have parents that truly love you, and you have grandparents that care for you, and that you have a good relationship with your families, and you take pride in who you are. The design by both Canada and the United States, very specific, very precise, very exact, was to destroy that, so that when you were placed in these schools, you were abandoned, literally, in that the feeling of despair by the children at having been abandoned into these institutions you carried throughout your life. That it was an attempt to break that bond. And when you were taken, as I was, and then your parents had nothing to say about it. Now, you can imagine the federal government with its infamous black helicopters coming into Orlando and selecting one of you and taking you, and your parents were coming and raising a fuss and opposing it. You couldn't do that in Canada, the United States, on Indian reservation, because you'd be arrested. You'd be confined. The parents would become criminals if you dared interfere with the power of the state to take children. And children had, you're not aware of how this is happening. All you know is that one day as I was. You're in school, and the next day you're on a train, and that train is taking you, oh, geez, how much? 4 times, 5 times, about 500 kilometers away from your home. And then in the middle of the night, which is what they did to me, they take you in January through this place here, this part of the building. And then once you're in that building, you're told what's to be expected of you. Your entire reality shifts. You're given a number. This is critical because everybody processed in residential schools in Canada, your name was replaced by this number. See, there's my number, 4827338. That was your file number. That was who you were as far as the federal government was concerned. That was not tattooed, but it was put on all of your clothing. So you lost your identity. Your given name was taken away. If you had a native name, that was taken away. If you spoke a native language, that was severely restricted. You couldn't do it. You just couldn't do it. And then you were placed in schools where, when you arrived, not so much where the Mohawks came from, but here, during the residential school era, this is what the children would look like when they were brought to one of these 533 boarding schools. That's what they look like. Very beautiful people, wouldn't you agree? Handsome, well-dressed. And their parents put on the best clothes as they were being forcibly ripped, literally, from the embrace of their mother and father. And thinking that maybe when they got to the school, that sense of dignity and cultural pride would be preserved. Instead, what they do, they stripped you naked, took all of that stuff. We don't know what happened to these things, which is invaluable articles of clothing and cultural patrimony. Probably put on the market, in some cases burned. This is the transformation that would take place from here, very decided native looking, to here. And they put you in this kind of militaristic environment that was actually less military than it was prison. And that they were places of confinement. The transformation that would take place on the children was almost complete. Alienation from your families, no visitations, and you were kept in confinement here literally for years. This is my school. This is the place in which we walked, and we were assigned our number and placed in the dorm. Gender separation was almost total. Very little communication between the girls and the boys. Even if you were brothers and sisters, you rarely were able to talk to each other. Some of the enforced conversion into Christian beliefs every night. This is what I would have to go through. Is you sit, kneel on top of your bunks or on the side of your bunks, and then pray to a God that you just couldn't understand why any benevolent being would tolerate the kind of abuse that took place here. Now, what happens after this? This is really interesting and sad, is that the supervisors who are around us, someone's taking this picture, they had free reign to do what they wanted with the kids. No restriction, no policing, no government reports, no medical reports. When the Canadian government set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008, and they solicited testimony from myself and thousands of other victims of this system, and they said, well, your allegations about abuse, and you can imagine what kind of abuse took place here, it has to be substantiated if you're going to qualify for government compensation. And what Canada did, and I hope the Americans will not do, is they began to give us points, and we cashed in those points given the degree of sexual or physical abuse that we suffered on these schools. And then they told me, while I'm in this meeting with government officials, this tribunal, prove it. Yes, we believe that this happened, but there's no substantiation under the Canadian laws. If you're a child making an allegation against an adult, there has to be some kind of substantiation. And how could you prove it? You think they're going to give us access to a doctor who can physically examine the bodies of these victims, living bodies of children, and say that this happened at the hands of an adult? They did, of course, they didn't keep records. During my whole tenure at this school, a year and a half, I don't recall one child ever being given permission to go see a doctor or a hospital, despite many of the injuries suffered by these children, because it was a work camp. You had to earn your way. And every night we had to do this. And the predatory behavior that took place here when lights were out at 8:30 in the evening was terrible. What we did in the morning, it was they got us up at 6 o'clock, and you can imagine 6 o'clock in the winter in Canada, absolute black. They would come through the dorms ringing a big bell, and then we would get up. We would get our bunks ready. They had to be like the U.S. Marines, you know, when you flip a coin, you see that, and it had to bounce. Well, it had to be that way. And then we were assigned janitorial duties, which we had to clean every part of the dorm and the floors, small little, not quite toothbrush size, but very small brushes, bristles. And we worked at that for an hour with these harsh chemicals, and then we lined up for dinner or breakfast. And breakfast, the reason we called this particular place the mush hole throughout Canada, it's known as that, is because the food we were given was barely enough to keep us alive. We were on semi-starvation diet. We had to work. When we went to school, X number of hours in a given day. Afterwards, you worked as farmhands. And this was slavery because there was no compensation for it. And I really mean that, because a lot of these kids, the boys, when they got older, you were trained for manual labor, and that manual labor was in turn farmed out to different communities around the Mohawk Institute at no charge to the person to whom you were assigned. And you were lucky if you got a meal or two out of that, but it was intense physical labor. We were lined up at dining hall, and then we were fed out of this communal kitchen. The girls were assigned KP duty. And the diet in the morning consisted of a small bowl of gruel, a porridge, watery, and with powdered milk and white toast. Now you got to understand the biology of Native people and how we were not able to process wheat, but nonetheless, that was our primary source of carbohydrates was wheat. So a lot of kids got sick, but again, there was no medical care whatsoever for us, and a lot of illness. Communicable diseases were common because, again, we didn't receive medical care. Whoops, something here. Okay, let's see if I can go this way. There you go. And the girls were trained as domestics. Again, any chance for a young lady to exercise her inherent intelligence or curiosity was thwarted, dissuaded, and the reason I use this photograph is because it's something really unique in that you have this. That's almost the only exception I can find in hundreds of photographs where one of the Native kids is actually smiling. But that's what you were trained as young women, domestics. Kids were channeled either to go to prison, reformatories, or the military. And we had the highest rate of service in the Canadian Army during World War II, the same with the US, Vietnam, and even Iraq. My brother was a Marine veteran of Desert Storm in Vietnam. But Natives have always enlisted at an unusually high rate despite all of these experiences with Canada and the United States, these adverse experiences. Some of the areas of confinement, our so-called playroom, wasn't much to play in there, but what they did have was asbestos-lined pipes and lead. That was how we got our main drinking water and how we took our collective showers. That's the wall that we that we etched our names on, so people would know that we were actually there. And that wall still stands. When the government wanted to obliterate the residential schools, this was targeted, because when you go there and you see that, it's hard for people not to have an emotional reaction, because these are children. I have to be emphatic about that. These are children. And I was a child, 11 and 12 years old. and undergoing enormous physical changes and trauma. During the course of a day, you would have three great things that would eat at your soul, your very being. One of them was physical hunger. You were always hungry. One of the good things about our friendship with the Crees, who came from northern Quebec, by the time I was assigned to this place, most of the students were Cree. They knew how to live off the land, even more so than we did as Mohawks. And they taught us that a primary source of protein, if the school wasn't giving it to us, was insects. So the Crees taught us which insects you could eat that actually tasted okay. You know, like butterflies. Pluck off the wing of butterflies and you eat that. At least it got some protein. Stay away from the green-skinned insects because of the bitterness of the taste. But hunger was constant in our minds. And then we also felt fear of being selected for abuse by these supervisors. And then what happened is that learned behavior, you know, about how to control other people. You know, from American prisons, every good American prison movie will tell you that the only way the warden and the bosses can control that prison is they got to have inmates involved in exploiting the younger and the weaker, the predatory behavior. Same way in our school, that most of the sexual and physical violence came about when the older boys took advantage of the younger boys. If you were a younger 5-year, 6-year-old boy, and I remember this really clearly in my dorm, and you heard a young boy, he's 6, removed from Cree territory or a Mohawk, and they're sitting in their bunk bed, and they can't stop, but they have to cry. So lonely. They want human interaction. They want assurance. They want to be somebody to tell them that things are going to be okay. Yes, you could find somebody that would give you a physical embrace, but you know you had to. It was at the cost of your body. And what happened during night here, every night, it's almost too much for me to even tell you. All those kids cried, and you get mad at them. You get mad at them. You remember there's a scene. What's that famous movie? Full Metal Jacket, in which that guy just can't blend with the other soldiers, and he cries and he gets mad, you know, at night, and they come and they beat the heck out of him, his own friends. They beat him with these bars of soap just to get him to shut up. That's same with us. You know, one kid cries, you allow that to continue, and the whole dorm is affected by that. And it was that intense. But this is the last victim. I need to point him out because he was my friend, Joey Commanda, Algonquin Indian from north central Ontario. The last victim there, we were the same age. He was quite a bit smaller than I was. And as he did what we as Mohawks did, and when Tom referred to me being expelled, it wasn't just me, it was our whole group from my community of Akwesasne. For the first and only time in residential school history in the United States or Canada, that a group, an entire group, had been told not to come back. Well, Joey was sent back, and we protected him. But he knew that he was vulnerable, that the predators were going to come after him. So he ran away, made it almost to central Toronto, and then he got hit and killed by a train. September 3rd, 6 p.m., 1968. After that, Canada phased out boarding schools. This became such a widespread scandal, what was happening to these children. And to this date, nobody has ever been brought to justice, with one exception. One priest in Manitoba was jailed for what he did to the kids. But the ones who did what they did to us, no justice. The Pope shows up a year and a half ago, an apology tour. They asked me to talk to him. I said I would. And then they said, oh, you have 1 minute, photo op with the Pope. But he crazy. What I need is the Catholic Church to admit what it did, take full responsibility, and provide adequate compensation and justice according to the survivors, how we see justice, not how Canadian bureaucracy sees it. But the church has been extremely evasive about its duty towards us and the children, the dead. And not just the Catholic, but the Anglican Church, what you call in the United States Episcopalians, the nicer ones. Nonetheless, there's thousands of Native children that are put in mass graves, and we're trying our hardest to find them. And so we work with this is Native police, and we work with modern technology to find out where these graves are located, because it's imperative that we bring justice to the children. And we use this kind of device, ground radar. And to us, what's so important is justice cannot be realized until all those children are accounted for and then returned to their respective communities. But along that way, we need to have a contemporary science, forensic anthropologists, medical examiners, to tell us how the children died. And then when we turn, their remains will tell us much of that story. So if a child was brutalized, if they were starved, if they suffered from illness, if some of the girls died giving birth, all of that will show in the bones. We have to find the bones. In Canada, there's a great wave of concern because they are finding the graves, and they are slowly beginning to uncover those graves. It's Canada's greatest crime, and it defines that nation. Here in the United States, probably, I would have to take a guess. Very few have actually have heard of this phase of our collective history, and it doesn't register at all in the United States. It's not an issue that is taught in schools, but it has to be, because it's fundamental to the American conscience that somehow we have to make amends with what happened to those children. This is Vancouver, and I was there last year this week, and again, we're building a national movement. And what I'd like to do is encourage you to think about this, to hold your elected leaders so that they were also aware of this, and that they could take the necessary steps in the U.S. towards reconciliation. Some of the spontaneous memorials left. This is in front of the Mohawk Institute, and where I walked up those steps as a 11-year-old boy in 1967. Alcatraz, I show this picture because there's two interesting connections between boarding schools and Alcatraz. This was begun as a prison not for American criminals, but for Hopi men who dared defy the federal government and said, well, you're not taking our children. And the result was American military went into Hopi land in Arizona, took the Hopi men and put them here in Alcatraz a few days. But not everything was terrible. Most of it was. It did produce some interesting characters. One of them was the greatest athlete in U.S. history, right? You all know who this is? Anybody throw a football ever? Know who this is? You don't? Oh. You know, Jim Thorpe. And you know who founded the NFL, right? You guys love Buccaneers and Dolphins. You know who founded this NFL? This is so crazy that you don't know this. You're all going to be riveted to what's happening this weekend. And Jim Thorpe. And it was American Indians who founded the NFL and created the greatest football dynasty in the early part of the 20th century, the Carlisle Indians, out of a boarding school. Just shows you that our contributions to the U.S. are largely obscure. This is my cousin who led the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969, which initiated the contemporary Indian rights movement. What he did is he swam to Alcatraz in November of 1969 wearing cowboy boots. And when you see him on the film and he's doing this swimming, perfectly Mohawk thing to do, but he was from my community and he was my grandmother's grandson. Wilma Mankiller, one of the leaders of the Cherokee Nation, again, someone who is subject to forcible relocation from her home in Oklahoma, but managed to come back. Dennis Banks, leader of the American Indian Movement, a product of a boarding school. And much of the core leadership and resistance of Native people came from victims of these boarding schools, even though they might have lost language, even though their bodies might have been harmed by this, even though they might have been consumed by substance abuse, still they found it in themselves a means to resist. Taking back of territory that we consider ours was a direct product of residential schools because we became politically engaged. Here at Wounded Knee, 51 years ago, the most intense armed standoff within the continental United States in the 20th century happened in South Dakota at Wounded Knee for over 100 days, 3.5 months. A group of armed Native people from throughout North America, along with their non-Native allies, held off units of the American military, again in defense of Native sovereignty. And out of that comes whatever else you see that defines Native life. So if I was to go into the United States, even poll you right now and ask you, what do you think about Native, indigenous issues right now? What do you know about indigenous issues? What's the one thing that's going to come up in your mind? This, right? Gambling, gambling, gambling. None of that would have been possible if 50 years ago, if these people hadn't took a stand and pushed off the worst elements of state jurisdiction. Florida, Washington State, matter of fact, one of the historic cases in Supreme Court happened here in Florida when the state tried to stop the Seminoles from opening a bingo hall just a couple years after Wounded Knee. But given the Native resistance, that the states had no choice but to retreat. And with that came an explosion in certain types of Native economy, and that is defined by casinos. So most Americans, when they think about Natives at all, other than the Seminole chop, they think about casinos. But it's all directly related to our experiences as victims of these boarding schools and a refusal to be obliterated and turned out. And sometimes we have an opportunity to actually teach the best elements of our philosophies and ideals. And you know who this is, right? One of the most important men of the 20th century, as critical in world history as Winston Churchill or Joseph Stalin. Does your teachers know who this is? There he goes. He knows. He knows. He knows. That's Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, the one who led people towards the dissolution of the USSR, the Soviet Union. And he found himself in our territory. And why is he there? This is about a decade and a half after the dissolution of the USSR. And he comes to Iroquois territory because he's intrigued by our traditional teachings when it comes to the environment. Because throughout his life, after he left chairmanship of the Soviet Union, he dedicated himself to ecological issues and became a proponent of that principle that I told you about in the beginning, the seventh generation. Do nothing that harms the rights of the unborn. And he would cite that in many of his speeches, the seventh generation. And where did he learn that? From the Iroquois. And this is my wife, Joanne Shenandoah, and her aunt and my mother-in-law, the clan mother. But so it shows you a certain type of resistance that continues on even to the current day. So rather than sit there and become mere passive victims of the system, we find opportunities to work and change how people perceive us. And one of the ways we do that came to us was this. Now, what is the most powerful studio in the world? Entertainment. What is it? Marvel. Studio, movies, any kind of film production. Disney, Marvel, right? Disney, just down the road here. Well, Marvel came to us because one of its producers had learned about some elements of Iroquois life, Mohawk life, while a student at Syracuse University. And he came up to us and he asked my wife and I if we would work on this project that Marvel had in mind, and that was to present a Native American hero. But initially, it was different than this. It was a masculine type of Thor type thing. And we changed that. So what we did is we worked with Marvel for over 3 years, and we developed a character that was feminine but strong, not passive at all. And I said that to these other classes before this, is when you watch that film, Killers of the Flower Moon, what thing that really irritates the bloody heck out of Native women is how passive those women are when it comes to that abuse. Either they're drunk victims or else they allow their non-native husbands to exploit them. And they go into that office and they claim that they're incompetent, right? Is that the word? I'm incompetent. An Iroquois woman would never, ever stand for that kind of behavior. And so we wanted to personify the strength and inherent dignity of Native women without making them provocative in appearance like Wonder Woman. We wanted her to be dressed accordingly, and then all this design you see on here was my wife largely did that, Joanne Shenandoah. And then the storyline, when you see it, and here it is right here, you have to go on Disney Plus episode or season 2, What If, episode 6. And you're going to see something that's going to forever change the way you see Native people and Native women, because she's not a helpless victim, nor does she appeal to some non-native savior in order to help them out of their situation when they confront the Spanish conquistadors, right? And again, I'll say what's weird about Flowers and Moon is that the ultimate savior in that film for those Native women is who? J. Edgar Hoover. Isn't that totally obscene? Given what he did when it comes to American civil rights, the marijuana laws passed in the 1930s were specifically aimed at Black Americans, Latinos. What he did when it comes to infiltrating and undermining the Black Panther movement, what he did to Martin Luther King, what he did to the American Indian movement, and yet that film depicts him as this benevolent type of individual. It's just crazy. Well, we don't do that. There's no savior except for her. So we're trying to change the whole dynamic, to rise above being passive victims and actually define our reality. And what is the most powerful medium by which the world will see us? It's going to be this. And there'll be further episodes because of Disney is so overwhelmed with positive response to Kaholi that they're going to do other episodes. And one of the things they're going to propose is, what if Native people were not subjugated? What if we didn't suffer from disease? What happens if we still retained our land base and became and rose to a political and military power equal to, if not superior than, European colonies? What if? So, okay, go ahead. Yes, yes. Onward, because she is, of anything they've done recently, she's got the most response from Marvel. And so they're committed to carrying on with it. And they also did the Echo series where it has a Native woman, again, not passive, but strong. And so this is what we're hoping this will lead to years of this type of showing. And, and that this will cause a revolution amongst our kids, because we desperately need heroes like Wakanda and the Black Panther. Well, we need our own hero. And I think that's what inspired Disney and Marvel, is after the Black Panther movies, then they saw, why not Native people? And so they found this one producer who could actually pull it off, and he did. Yeah. Yes.
What was his name?
Ryan Little. Yeah, Ryan Little, graduate of Syracuse, has an excellent film school at SU. And one of his teachers was a personal friend of mine. And this is how that works. When I was showing Gorbachev and my wife, this is how we initiate massive social changes, not necessarily by confronting the oppressor. It's by individual acts of kindness and enlightenment. And that leads to a change of mind. For instance, I invited Marco Rubio tomorrow to come here. I doubt if he will, but anyway, that's how we do it. We affect these things. And that's how we got to where we were by just telling people the integrity of our story, the beauty of our story. And Marvel was looking for it because they had exhausted Thor and the rest of them, and they wanted something else. And they found this. And they gave us free reign. So what's good about this, when you watch it, it's almost 90% in Mohawk, a language that almost came close to extinction, but we revived it. And so the actors, even they're animated, but the actors are all speaking Mohawk, and that's what you're going to learn when you watch this. That's what we're hoping kids around the world will learn it, and they will. And it'll lead to this revolution. But it's using kind of like a cultural judo in that we don't have access, we don't control Marvel, but we can use Marvel in order to affect some kind of greater good, some kind of dynamic. And that's exactly what we're doing. So the road, the path from my being confined in a dormitory, laying on that bed, middle of the night, protecting myself, hungry, feeling abandoned and angry, leads directly to this. But it tells you what can be done if you don't allow your oppressors to obliterate you, which was the design of the residential schools. Now, I'll give you one other statistic, is that I just found out yesterday, is that in the year 1900, natives came that close to extinction, that close. 24,000 native people were left out of a population at time of contact of maybe 15 million, 220,000. That's how effective the forces were against us. In 1928, of that 224,000, 60,000 native children were placed in these boarding schools. It is by far the most devastating effect on our history, our health, our current status, short of those great plagues and the military invasions of the 18th to 19th centuries. It's the third greatest factor in our collective lives. And without understanding that and appreciating what I've told you about how we lived and barely survived in those schools, then you don't understand Native people at all. Boarding schools were extremely powerful, extremely effective, and did destroy literally thousands of lives. But enough of us managed to emerge out of that with some sense of dignity intact, and that's where we are now. Right now, 224,000 in 1900, there are just under 3 million Native people who are really Native people, who have membership within their respective nations, around 3 million that. So we've rebounded quite a bit. And of the 6,000 Iroquois who were living in 1900, we're up to about 120,000 now. So we've managed to partially recover those losses. So we're in a state of expansive growth right now. And you'll see more of these type of things come over because it sets a standard against everybody else has to meet those standards. So, okay. I think we got time. Sure. Okay, let's have some questions. Everything you want to know about Aboriginal people, I'll tell you. Everything. Okay, go ahead. Yes, you'll see it throughout this series. When you watch it, you're going to see the color blue. That's my idea. This is me. When they were talking about how Kaholi, and that's an old Wolf Clan name, I came up with the name, incidentally, with my wife. And then she's got little crystals here. Where we come from, you see I mentioned the 7 dancers, the Pleiades. That's what my wife put on her necklace here. And so, yes, we do use crystals. And you'll see it in the show. There's crystals as a healing device, and people in their medicine, when they carry medicine around with them, will use crystals. So yes, very important to us. And the biggest crystals, the finest crystals are in Mohawk country, about 60 miles east of Albany. There's just, you can go there and still gather them, but those are critical to us, the crystals. Yeah. I haven't tried that. There's a certain ritual that goes with that. And what happened is when we lost most of our people through the plagues that continued on to my community up to the year 1900, that there was a disruption in knowledge. You know how the Black Plague in Europe completely changed the course of European life. But in our case, the most vulnerable people were the elderly, kind of like COVID-19, and the young. So those people who had that knowledge, all we have left is an echo of that knowledge, you know? And they used to use crystals, and they told us crystals. So when Marvel was coming to me, and I said, what is blue is the light coming from those crystals. When you could bend light, because we knew that you could do that long before Isaac Newton. And you could bend time, you know, because everything is secular. And you could bend time, and you could actually find your place in another universe, in another reality. And but crystals is the mean by which you would begin that search. And so yes, they're out throughout this film. But the knowledge of how to do that specifically, there are people we think that might have it. So we're actively searching for those native people who might have guarded that secret. And, oh, you have a question? Yeah. 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 You did? Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. We said modesty was first. And she's not going to be Pocahontas, you know, with that slit thing there they had in Disney. And that's not the way. This is a Mohawk woman in all aspects. And she's modeled after my wife, and my wife was 19. And she's self-assured. You see the way she's holding her hands? And then the conquistadors, people had questions. Are the conquistadors, they really find themselves up in New York State? Well, they did. We do know that there were at least 3 expeditions that were actively searching for what they thought was here in Orlando, and that is what? The Fountain of Youth. Why did they want the Fountain of Youth? And you saw it in the film, is because they think that's a way for them to escape punishment for the horrible crimes they committed. And so they want to find their way in there, you know? And they find it in upstate New York. And in fact, according with Mohawk teaching, there are portals, are ways to bend time, like I said, and space. And if you know the right place, using crystals, you can actually go from one dimension to the next, which is now they're proving with black holes and various other observations, celestial observations. But I'll tell you this right now, I've never come across a teaching of our Mohawk people that is inconsistent with hard physical science. You know, whether it comes to human origins, sources of human intelligence, whether it's space-time observations or Newton's laws of physics, they're all consistent with Aboriginal life, you know, Aboriginal life. Okay. Yeah. There's another one, what was it called? It was done in the American Revolution about 5, 6 years ago, and they had a Mohawk hero on it. But nothing like this, not to this degree, where it actually uses the language as a primary means of communication. And what you're going to see here is what you'll observe is you got the 2 principals talking to each other in normal language. It's not just stereotypical language or just guttural language or Mohawk responding to somebody else with a couple syllables, right? That's the standard when it comes to native language. But it's the main way they talk to each other in the way we're talking now. And that was an experiment by Marvel because no one had ever tried this before. Can you do this with a native language? Well, we pulled it off. Yeah, 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 yeah. That was amazing. That was historic. Okay. Yes. Yeah, isn't that great? Isn't that great? It's wonderful. It's yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 Well, what they made a mistake in Canada when they came up with the Truth and Reconciliation and the 98 points they came up with, there was not full consultation with the actual survivors. That the Canadian government did not send people to us, and there are many survivors in Canada, very few in the United States, and ask us, what does justice mean for you? What does reconciliation mean for you? What does compensation mean for you? So it was coming from the government once again, policies implemented in Ottawa, and then forced upon us, and it just didn't work. So we need to avoid that mistake. So in the United States, we need an apology from Joseph Biden or whoever's the next president, Gavin Newsom from California, whoever your next president is. We need a formal acknowledgement that crimes were committed, grievous crimes, even worse than what happened during the internment of Japanese. And we need to acknowledge a formal apology followed by a policy that is developed and enacted by us, the Native people, not coming again from Washington. That has to be the case. In the pursuit of justice and the right allocation of science and technology so that we can recover the missing children and then thereby bring peace to our communities. And then an absolute commitment to justice, meaning if there are people alive who did this thing to these children, they have to be held accountable. If they are not alive, and most are not, then the institutions that oversaw these schools have to be held accountable. You know, they have to be held accountable. And in Canada, the church had such a prime position of influence that it exempted itself from any kind of the Roman Catholic Church, from criminal repercussions for their part in this terrible thing. So we can avoid that. We can form a committee. We can ask U.S. senators and the House of Representative people, and I will work with your instructors to find out how we can influence that. And then, you know, following the president's apology, we can create this commission and finally bring healing to this issue. It needs to be understood in all American schools. It's not revisionism. It's not part of that, what do they call it in America, woke thing? Woke. It's an integral part of American history that simply cannot be denied. And it's the children, students need to hear about this. And so that's what we're hoping, that's what we're advocating. Start with the apology, the creation of a joint committee, and then we can develop a strategy for returning the children back home. That's my primary concern. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. No, no, no. I love your interest.
As for like, so you designed this character with your
Yes.
wife, and it was based off of.
Yeah.
How did you come out up with like designing like or like powers? Because I'm imagining
Yeah.
like each of them like
Yeah.
something of your ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. What we did is first we got her look, and then you see all these subtle designs here. That's all very typical Iroquois Mohawk. The use of blue, because that's the power of our aura around each one of us. If we're in optimum good health, according to Mohawk teaching, you are surrounded by a magnetic force. That magnetic force that animals respond to is the color blue. And the color blue is the color of spirit beings. And so what she's able to do with her power is what you saw in the film. She's able to direct all those spiritual beings to a given end. Not that she has by herself super physical powers, but with that aura, with that blueness, with that power of the spirit, she's able to do that. And then you see here, she's got wampum on her wrist. That's also a source of power for her. But Kaholi, she's a conduit for the spirit beings to come out of the sky world and then to removed the Tanger, the conquistadors, from her area. And what I think you probably like is there's no such thing as a good guy on the European colonist side, is there? The antagonists, they're all Spanish or European, whatever, and the natives are different. And so what I had to do, as we say, when the Europeans came here, what they were struck by was the physical beauty of native people. You could read the diaries of Cristobal Colon, Columbus, and others. They were struck by the sheer physical beauty of native people. And so we asked the animators at Marvel to make sure that when they depicted us, male or female, that they showed that physical beauty. And you see it again in the film. And the contrast between our appearance and that of the Europeans is really remarkable. And that was very deliberate, because that was true. You know, the average height of a Mohawk at the time of contact was just around 6 feet, in contrast to the conquistadors. And they were like 5'4", 5'5". And they were decidedly different in physical appearance. We know that by the uniforms that they wore and that kind of stuff. So we wanted to show that too, that is historically accurate. Yeah.
One more question?
Yes. Yes, yes. Because your enzymes, because native people were, for time immemorial, had a certain type of diet that was high on natural proteins like fish and certain animals, and animals with low fat like buffalo and elk and deer. And then when Europeans came here, they brought milk products and cheese and wheat-based breads, and you just didn't digest it well. And if you did, what it did is it turned into sugar, and sugar for us resulted in diabetes. So in my community, we have a plague, and that's diabetes, because our enzymes refuse to properly process wheat-based products or milk-based products. We simply can't do it. And so we get sick, and then our lifespan is shortened. And the more we eat wheat, I'll give you one example. Our lifespan used to be, in mid-70s, a generation ago. Our current lifespan of a Mohawk man right now is 64 years. And almost all of that is because of the dietary change between living off the land, eating corns, beans, and squash, and fish, which is most of what we ate as children, and switching that to a cash-based economy where you buy processed foods. And so a lot of alcoholism, which is a great problem for us, is directly related to that diet, and that craving for sugar. So diabetes is becoming a really serious problem with us. But that's why we just can't digest it right. Okay. Hey, thank you. You guys are all right. Thank you for being here. Now, you got a test coming. Each one of your professors is going to give you an assignment.
Well, in my class they do.
You know what that assignment is, right? You go see this. And I'd like to, through Tom, I really want your honest opinions about Kaholi and what we did here.